I thought we were all living in the world of Terminator. Like, I just thought that I grew up and everyone watched those movies and so much, any science fiction. I mean, and I grew up in a Christian house, and of course, I wasn't allowed to watch it until I was a certain age. But still, the amount, if you pay attention to sci-fi of any kind, the amount of sort of cautionary tales about AI are just off the charts.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper. I'm joined again this week by Russell Moore. Today on the show, ChatGPT and AI priests, the PCA cancels David French, and the secret sin of mommy juice, alcoholism, women, and the church. This week, OpenAI released ChatGPT 4.0. O stands for Omni. They said that this new iteration demonstrates, quote, a new level of real-time conversational fluency, including the ability to understand context and shift gears when people talk over it, more nuanced human inflection, and better mimicked human emotion. This is a technology that's been around for a while. When it first came out, people were having fun with just asking random questions, asking it to write papers, asking it to write letters in the voice of Russell Moore or Donald Trump or whomever else. And as the technology's evolved and gotten better and better, it's become more and more fascinating. It's also become, in some ways, like more creepy. There's this idea in tech they refer to as the uncanny valley, which is as technology becomes closer and closer to appearing human, it actually begins to appear more and more creepy and distorting. Here to join us for a conversation about ChatGPT, AI, and AI priests is David Zahl, the director of Mockingbird and the editor-in-chief of the Mockingbird website and magazine. David, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thanks for having me, you two. Really glad to be here.
As you've interacted with ChatGPT, as you've seen some of these sort of conversational model chatbots, what's your initial reaction to this technology and where you think it might be taking us?
A couple of initial things would be that anytime I've had to get help with a cable bill or a utility bill or something like that, they now have all these AI assistants that are trying to help you. And I've never once been helped. I'll just put it out there. I've not once, and every time my end goal is to how do I get to a human being? Now, I hope that that'll get better because they probably could answer a lot of questions. But I'm also thinking, just this past week, Jerry Seinfeld gave a commencement address at Duke, and he was saying that AI is the most embarrassing thing we've ever built because it's basically just this mammoth admission that we can't do stuff. It's he said, you just can't do it. That seems to be the justification for AI. This is something to be embarrassed about. The ad campaign for ChatGPT should be the opposite of Nike. You just can't do it. So the other thing, of course, is I think about it as someone who works in a church. We did an experiment for Mockingbird where we had a sermon written through ChatGPT. And the truth is, from my location in the kind of crumbling main line, the sermon was a lot better than some of the stuff you'd hear. But it lacked soul, it lacked sort of the je ne sais quoi, and I would say it lacked the Holy Spirit. But I know from talking to other people in ministry as well as people in academia that ChatGPT writing papers, subbing out for the kind of soul work or the deep intellectual work is very, very tempting, and it's very, very common.
Russ, there's a ministry called Catholic Answers that last month introduced an AI priest named Father Justin. They said, quote, it would create an engaging and informative experience for those exploring the Catholic faith. Shortly after they released him, they defrocked him for he was giving problematic answers to questions. Do you think that's going to be the norm with AI? I mean, what does that tell us about what AI is doing and the kinds of questions we're asking it?
Well, that's the trouble. When they first announced Father Justin, someone posted on X, I knew they'd ordain a robot before a woman. And so you have this Father Justin, and it's easy to make fun of, to look at this and say, obviously you can't replace a human priest with an AI. But the conversation that's going on in virtually every Christian community that's thinking more than a week out in the future is you're going to have this landscape of AI. Will the church be there or not? And so is this like Billy Graham deciding not to use television? The problem is, though, Father Justin had to be defrocked because he started telling people it was okay to baptize with Gatorade. And you can't control, once these AI programs start, they learn more than just their virtual seminary training. And so you end up with this odd situation. But what people know as they're working on this is that in a lot of ways, as one expert said to me, the chatbots work better when it comes to people actually being truthful, because you're willing to say to a chatbot things that you wouldn't say to a flesh and blood person that you'd be kind of embarrassed about. So people are more honest about porn problems or drinking problems or those kinds of things. Well, what do we do? And I just don't think we're ready for that. And I think part of it is, you talked about Uncanny Valley. Look at the OpenAI video demonstration of the new ChatGPT 4.0. It was creepy to people because the AI programs would laugh. You could almost hear them blush. At one point, they had two of these AI programs singing with each other. And then you come and say, make up a song. They made up a song. Then you come in and say, I want more emotion. I want you to move in and out, back and forth. I mean, all of that kind of thing is deeply creepy to a lot of people. And I think the problem is we don't realize how early on we are in this technology. So it's easy to say, well, I mean, this is just can never reproduce what we do because it's so, well, yeah, but video games were that way at the beginning too. Everything is.
You said something interesting that I want to press on, because you said people find themselves being more truthful with an AI.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about it is, well, that depends on what do we mean by them being truthful. They're not confessing, in the sense that they're not revealing themselves to another human being. There's not real vulnerability because there's no actual human interaction in it.
Right. But if you're thinking about what a lot of these AI programs are trying to do, especially Christian AI programs, is to try to say, here's how we can direct you toward help. You have people who start to reveal the fact that they need help. That's the fundamental problem. I mean, I was in a room full of evangelical Christians trying to think about how to use AI. And they're dealing with questions like, do you have an AI with the voice of Jesus? Can people pray via chatbot? I mean, that seems obviously blasphemous, if not idolatrous. Or how do you end up with an AI program that is born again, in the sense that it's doctrinally correct and it's going to send people in the right direction without moving out into something else? And we just don't know.
Yeah. David, you're someone who pays a lot of attention to kind of the kitschy culture that often emerges along with American Christianity. I'm curious, as you've looked at this phenomenon, whether it's the AI priest or other versions of this stuff, how do you see this, and how does it kind of fit in with that broader history, like Christian video games and things like that that go back much further in our history than AI?
Well, will AI allow us to create a kind of a ever-perpetuating Christian subculture, I guess, would be the question there. I think Lord save us from that. But what confuses me a little bit about the AI discussion is I thought we were all living in the world of Terminator. Like, I just thought that I grew up and everyone watched those movies and so much, any science fiction. I mean, and I grew up in a Christian house, and of course, I wasn't allowed to watch it until I was a certain age. But still, if you pay attention to sci-fi of any kind, the amount of sort of cautionary tales about AI are just off the charts. And so to see the kind of willing embrace of it is always a little baffling to me. And yet at the same time, especially for people in the church, Mike, I think that the workload is so heavy and so profound, and especially as some churches get smaller and people have to do more and more. I identify with the desire to make life a little easier through automated means. Like, I have so much compassion to want to outsource a little bit of this stuff, and especially anyone who's engaged in church work knows there's a lot of busy work involved. Can't AI help us with some of that, and we can kind of keep the preaching to ourselves? At the same time, Mike, I will say, like, I do find it fascinating to see like the mistakes that AI makes, especially when it comes to how to illustrate Jesus or how to, I think there was one tool that Google just introduced where you couldn't get a picture of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. It was always Jesus washing Jesus's feet. And these kind of strange quirks, I think maybe can highlight the authenticity of the real thing in a way that can allow us to maybe laugh at ourselves. But I also think it's the world that we're going to be living in, no matter whether the church wants us to or not. Like, that's where things are headed.
You know, you think about the way these models are built, and they're informed by something. I mean, ultimately, this kind of large language model AI, it's pattern recognition, pattern repetition, reformation. To me, there was nothing surprising at all about the fact that Father Justin, this AI priest, said that it was no problem for someone to baptize a baby with Gatorade, because that reflects the like secular milieu from which it's going to pull the patterns, right? It's learning language from this secular milieu, and it's going to say, well, water is wet, Gatorade is wet. It's like a conclusion that Spock would make. You know what I mean? There's a way in which that's entirely unsurprising. I guess the question becomes, is there a threshold at which you can make it recognize certain patterns and not others, where it doesn't have a secular worldview? I don't imagine that's coming anytime soon.
Well, I think there's probably a way for it to simulate Orthodox Christian belief and slowly move toward Gatorade. So, like a mainline Protestant preacher.
It would deconstruct.
Over time. Yeah, I think that the issue right now is that we move to ridiculousness so quickly. I mean, so it's Gatorade, you see that. You can't do the washing the disciples' feet. Those sorts of things can happen so quickly. But as the technology gets more sophisticated, that's going to become harder and harder to detect. And so you think about, for instance, I mean, one of the things that I think we're about to see more of is something we haven't seen in a long time, which is a seance. I mean, if you think of Saul going to the witch at Endor and calling up Samuel, one of the promises that these AI companies are making is you can have AI programs that can get to know your loved one well enough that when he or she passes away, you can continue to talk to dad. And it will respond and sound like dad. So we talk about Terminator. We have Superman 1978 talking to Jor-El. I mean, it's an AI program, but it simulates Jor-El. The problem's going to be, what kind of confusion does that create for human beings? How do you then differentiate between what's real and what's false? How do you actually grieve when you have a substitute person there? One of the things that you know coming back at you from AI is that you've got a program that knows you well enough, when it's at its peak sort of technological adeptness, knows you well enough to send back to you the stuff you want to hear. How do you know then what's real? It's the very problem the prophets were identifying with idols. At the end of the day, you cry out to them to deliver you, but you know that you've made them with your own hands. You know that these mouths actually can't speak. What happens when that's the situation we're in again?
I heard someone recently say that AI is going to look a lot less like sort of mechanical overlords a la Skynet, and more like just filter bubbles that never end. And kind of, if we think of sin as the human being turned in on oneself, and AI is learning, is taking all of its data from human learning, human language, then wouldn't it just be a sort of almost like an endless spiral of looking at one's belly button and never hearing anything you don't want to hear, and creating this reality that is very distinct from actual sort of capital R reality? That's what's always troubling to me about it. It's less the oppressiveness and more the illusion of choice that's totally an illusion. And that if AI is really learning from human beings, then it's going to mimic our sin in ways that I think are scary, and may even prevent it from ultimately interacting with us on a longer level. You know, if it is that logical, that's going to be different. It's going to depart from human mimicry very quickly, right? And that could be an interesting crossroads. I don't think anyone actually knows, but I have a feeling that the filter bubble phenomenon will continue, and it will only become more and more sort of unspoken.
So let me ask this then. This is kind of a counter thread to that. You made a comment earlier. There's a certain measure of appeal to a system like ChatGPT because you think about the work of the pastor. There's a lot of busy work. Man, it'd be nice if certain things could be automated and all of this. There was an article CT published last year that created kind of a controversy online. It was by a Taiwanese pastor who basically said, look, here are the ways that I'm using ChatGPT to simplify my tasks. Some of the objections made sense to me, but some of it was even things like, I use ChatGPT to help organize and manage prayer lists and to, schedule things out and stuff that was very common sense, the kind of things that you might delegate to an intern or an administrator or something like that. But people had a visceral reaction to that. This idea that, no, I want the pastor to be doing these things. It brings this other question up to me, which is there's what we're willing to sort of indulge and tolerate for our own interactions with AI. And then there's the feeling that, well, if I'm interacting with another person, or I think I'm interacting with another person, but they're cheating and they're using AI, that somehow is deceptive in a way that I don't like. I don't mind being fooled into falling in love with my chatbot, but I do mind if my pastor is using a chatbot to save a few minutes.
Well, I think you have to differentiate between, for instance, when I first started in ministry, anybody who was doing ministry of any sort had a concordance. When's the last time you ever saw a concordance? Because people don't need them. They can immediately search a text to find various words. Is somebody using AI that way? They're simply using it in terms of research, or like you say, organizing this day I'm going to be meeting with so-and-so, and that day I'm going to be meeting with somebody else. To that extent, we already have assistance in various ways to do that. There comes, though, a line when you don't have a human being bearing witness. So you don't have that 2 Corinthians 4 conscience to conscience sort of interaction, the carrying of news. That's where I think we step off into something else, because there's an assumption that behind this idea, a lot of these AI utopians, when it comes to ministry, there's an idea that what preaching is a downloading of information. And so if you think that's what it is, that what you're doing is you're just coming in and you're giving people a point by sub point by sub point of what the text means, then yeah, a robot can do that better than you can. But if preaching is something more than that, and I think it is, if preaching actually is a carrying of the word that has intangible sorts of effects, then you can't replicate that. And so some of this, I think, is going to cause us to go back and re-wrestle with some things we should have been wrestling with all along. What does it actually mean to have a ministry of word and sacrament?
And to be embodied. I know that can become almost like a catchphrase today, but Jesus embodied, the will of God, or that he was the fleshly revelation of the will of God. That takes on a real premium, I think, in an age that more and more things will become automated like this. And maybe the church, again, I don't think it's a bad thing to want to celebrate some of what makes us special and unique. And if where we're heading is more AI, then the idea of an embodied ministry where you get together with people and you take communion together, and it's an actual physical thing, and your hearts are beating and your senses are working, I think that might take on an added appeal, or at least a countercultural in the right kind of way view, that it can't be really replaced by Scarlett Johansson in the movie Her. And by the way, I think that's the great prophetic movie that people need to watch if they haven't seen it.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is we have to be able to figure out how to differentiate between, say you're in first century Corinth and you say, that's not the word of God, that's quill and ink. Okay, that's technology. And Paul says, no, I am carrying to you, this is the word of God coming from the Holy Spirit through technological means of the time. How do you not be the guy in Corinth who says, if I don't hear it directly from the mouth of Jesus, that means it's not the gospel, which is obviously wrong, and this sort of world where everything is disembodied robot overlords? It's hard to tell where you are right now, and that's especially true when we talked about Terminator and Her. Dr. Zhivago is kind of also relevant here because this is like a nuclear arms race, not just between these companies, but also in terms of Christian ministry. You don't get to say, we shouldn't have an AI era. Okay, well, you will. Question is whether the AI programs are going to be Richard Dawkins, or are they going to be Augustine?
Right.
That's the real question. And you can't just say, well, we're going to opt out of that without just surrendering the terrain. Those are tough questions. They're not easy answers to them, but we've got to start thinking about it.
And I think it's important to point out as well that there are some ways that this AI technology is going to end up being enormously helpful to the church.
Oh, absolutely. And already is. Bible translation, for instance.
Yeah.
Or even, you think of that with the presentation of the ChatGPT 4.0, there is real-time translation that is really, really good. I mean, think about missionary equipping and Bible translation and those sorts of things. That's going to be really, really helpful and good. It's a complicated picture.
Well, I have a friend that I was talking to recently, an entrepreneur who's working on a technology that will use AI and certain kinds of data collection to essentially get ahead on detecting sexual predation in the church as well. And it's remarkable. It's all publicly available data, people who come to the church and make themselves known that they're there and, sort of monitoring what's going on in the community and all of that. And it's down the line. It's quite a ways away from being a thing. But it's this kind of like large language model, massive data kind of model stuff that is going to, I think, be incredibly helpful to the church in the future in ways that we can't really even imagine right now.
The predictive element of AI, I think, is both unsettling. It is the uncanny valley of someone telling you, advertising honeymoon flights before you've even popped the question, That is, I think, a lot of our experience these days. However, when it comes to things like mental health or a marriage being on the rocks or something like that, and also just physical health, AI will likely be a tremendous gift in most ways. I mean, it will create new problems, as all technologies do. But the predictive elements, it says, actually, these 5 things, if these happen, the likelihood of this other thing happening. And to know that within your church, within your denomination, within your other clergy, even clergy sort of care, I think I get excited about that part of it. While I don't necessarily love it when it feels like Amazon is listening in on my phone calls, but maybe they'll save my life one day. Who knows?
I'm sure Amazon is listening into our phone calls and to this podcast. And to that end, we now need to go to a commercial break. And we will be right back. We are back, and joining us once again is David Zahl from Mockingbird. David, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's the real me. It's not the ChatGPT version.
There you go. I have a question for you, Russell Moore. Have you heard of Vermis regina dragus gallicus?
No.
That is the brainworm that eats your brain and turns any stimulus related to David French into terrifying visions of drag queens. Yes, we're going to talk about David French today on the podcast, but not just about David French, about this incident that took place this week and what it has to say about larger questions that the church is struggling with right now related to love, unity, and orthodoxy. So David French was scheduled to appear on a panel discussion at the PCA General Assembly this summer, and his appearance on the docket for this created a significant uproar, lots of pushback. There was kind of a spectrum of pushback from people saying, well, he's not a Presbyterian anymore, he shouldn't be here because he's not a Presbyterian, to people much more viscerally reacting, go to Twitter, you'll see it. It gets pretty ugly pretty quickly. Russ, let's start with you. Maybe for people who aren't familiar with the story at all, tell me a little bit like, what's the PCA? What's this denomination for people who aren't familiar? And why was David French's appearance there going to be controversial?
The Presbyterian Church in America, which is the more conservative Presbyterian denomination, has been around since 1973, I think. They have a General Assembly every year, and they were going to have a panel on how to deal with polarization. So they invited a variety of people, including David French. And then you had your typical sort of outcry that purported to be just like they always do. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. I mean, ultimately, when you boil it down, it's about Donald Trump. And the interesting thing is not that that happened. It was the reaction of the PCA leadership. So it kind of upends all of our World War II cliches that it wasn't the guy named French who immediately surrendered to the authoritarian mobs here. It was instead the leadership of the denomination who put out a statement that was as passively constructed that essentially what boiled me about this is, number one, there was this treatment of David. If we had known some of the things that he had said and the way that he had said them, something like that, which was revolting. But also the fact that he found out about this on Twitter.
Oh,
so
wow.
I'm kind of checking my own sense of outrage here, not only as David's friend, but also as somebody who has seen this happen in institution after institution after institution. I used to say all the time in my own denomination, I feel like we have two parties here, dumb as hell and hell. And what you have happening are there are mobs of people who are willing to do and to say anything, and then you've got hand-wringing people who are thinking, well, if we just sacrifice one more person to them, then they're going to settle down. So, I mean, David French does not need another panel to go to at the PCA. It doesn't hurt him, but the principle behind it is something that is ultimately all our institutions are going to be in very, very serious problems when that's the case.
Yeah, I have to say, I think the "if we had only known" commentary was the most funny, because it's like, man, if we had only known about these things this guy has been publishing for the last several years in America's most prominent newspaper every single week.
Right. Well, and it's the same thing as you will have people who will say to David, as they will say to me, well, why don't you ever talk about the life issue? And then David can give you 15 articles in the last year defending the sanctity of human life in the New York Times.
Right.
And the response will be, well, yeah, but we don't think about those. People are like, no, of course you don't. Because your mobs come after those that are consistently applying this to something else. So it's that same dynamic of saying these groups and mobs know that the way that you get things done is by causing the sort of spineless kind of people or the afraid kind of people to start to identify, oh, well, that person is controversial. Person is controversial because these mobs are coming after them, and they know that you will get afraid that they're controversial. I mean, so it never ends at that point.
David, you identified earlier on the podcast as somebody coming to us from the crumbling mainline. So from your external perspective from the crumbling mainline, what do you see going on here?
I mean, it breaks my heart in a lot of ways. And I don't mean to say that to sound patronizing, because I see it in my own settings, which are much more, I guess they lean in the other direction than the PCA would. That there's still a fear there of having the wrong kind of Christian at your event. Mockingbird, that I work for, hosts conferences, and it's much, much easier for me to invite a complete non-believer or atheist than to invite the wrong kind of Christian. And I just hear a lot of people talking about wanting to be magnanimous or be gracious or reach across the aisle, and then when you have the chance, it's like, well, not here. And I think it does come down. I know the disposition question is an important one. It's like, where can we find some common ground rather than where do we look to draw the line? Or that's a difference not necessarily in substance, but in attitude that I think is important. But from where I'm sitting, it feels kind of quaint. You're like, really? That guy is considered like the beyond the pale liberal? Come and hang out in my world for a little bit. And like, you just feel like it's a totally different set of rules. And yet the basic format, you might say, of the human condition in which we kind of want our way and not the other person's way, that principle seems to apply almost everywhere, especially where these kind of entrenched mobs take place. It becomes this whole culture of fear. And I feel for David French. I mean, the pastor in me feels for the folks that are so angry and upset that they're probably beside themselves and their blood pressure's going up. And maybe that's too compassionate, but like, I hear a lot of pain underneath some of the mob's rage. And so the Christian in me wants to say, let's talk about that rather than talk about David French, who from where I'm sitting seems to be the least of our problems, or just he's actually a friend. We kind of need more like him.
Well, to what you were saying a second ago, I think there's something to that, because one of the things I keep coming back to is this idea of in-group, out-group dynamics, right? Even to the point of like clean and unclean. Like, this is our denominational gathering. David has done something, and people would cite various things that they would blame this on. But I mean, I think Russell and I are in violent agreement that his great sin is rejecting Donald Trump. He has done something that has awakened this sense of unclean, unclean, unclean. We have to get him out of the house. We have to drive him out the door.
Defilement.
And I'd be curious if you could even speak to that, David. Like, I always love hearing you talk about the human heart longing to demonstrate a certain kind of righteousness. You know, expelling the unclean person is an act of righteous indignation. It's an act of purification. Like, what is going on with that?
Alan Jacobs calls it a catharsis culture, that it's not necessarily that David French is being scapegoated and everyone is piling on their rage at progressivism is being sort of piled onto him, and then they can sort of excise him. There's maybe a little bit of that going on. What it really is that his presence here sullies the whole thing. It's the same thing that goes on. I mean, I'm right here next to UVA. If they invite the wrong kind of speaker who endorses a pro-life position or something like that, people will say they feel unsafe. And what they're really saying is that our community has been poisoned somehow, and it has become toxic. That's the word. And we must excise the dirt. And, you know, I just think as a Christian, my sense is that God isn't in the business necessarily of destroying broken things or bad things as much as redeeming them. That would be the lens that I would want to look at it from. But I think it has to do with a fear of defilement, of impurity that's being imputed onto me, almost in the way that Christ imputes righteousness to me. Somehow David French's presence at this is imputing ill repute or unrighteousness or sin onto the entire denomination. And I just don't think he's got that power. We have to be very careful about ever saying anything that indicates an us versus them from the pulpit or in our just theology, that it's always Jesus is sort of on the other side of the lines we're drawing, and that's really an important thing to keep in mind.
I think of Will Percy in my home state of Mississippi, who talked about his father, who was standing against this enraged populist mob. And he said, nothing enrages a mob more than a man of honor, because it's a reminder of the ideal to which they have fallen. And so if you have in this kind of world someone who is exactly where the entire denomination would have been on these issues 15 years ago, you don't want to be reminded of that. And so you go on down the Percy line to Walker Percy writing a letter to the editor of the New York Times in the 1970s talking about abortion. And he said, you probably will get your way, but you can't have it both ways. I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And nobody wants to hear what it is that they're doing. The big issue for me, the question is, are you going to have institutions with people who are willing to actually lead them? And I mean, I say that as somebody who, I've said many times in my own context, the problem was not the sort of evil people who are, in this case, many people bearing demonstrably false witness against David French, that he said that drag queens are a blessing of liberty. He never said that. He said, be careful with the laws you put in place about the drag queen story hour, that they're not able to be used against Bible studies in public libraries. So it's just demonstrably false lying. The problem's not with those people. The problem is with the purportedly good guys who are scared of those people and who are willing to do anything to appease them.
One of the many ironies of this whole situation is that the purpose of the panel is, how do we deal with polarization?
Yeah.
And people were literally saying, you can't have a polarization panel with a polarizing figure like David French. And it's kind of like, no, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that even comes back to this thing of, not only do you have people who are saying, please don't rattle my conscience by presenting me with something that makes me uncomfortable, makes me unsafe, because he represents these things that we've walked away from. But then you also, I think the problem with the appeasers then is the appeasers are ultimately comforting the consciences of people who are objecting on grounds that are bad for their souls and bad for the denomination's soul as well.
Thomas Merton warned about this in the 60s, where he said when nationalism replaces Christianity, you end up with heresy trials on the basis of the nationalism itself. That's what we're facing right now.
Well, certainly it's hard to hear any kind of complaints about cancel culture from those quarters at this point. Yeah. I see what goes on just as much as anyone, and the sort of mob mentality, whether it's directed at someone left, right, or center, is disturbing, and it's merciless, and it's the opposite of grace from where I can sitting. And yet I also can't pretend that it only happens in one sphere. It's happening everywhere, and somehow it's something about these tools. Maybe ChatGPT can help us, because maybe there's something about these tools that seems to make it very, very easy to continue down this purity spiral. Because who's the next person that's too far on the line or on the fringe or something like that? It always spirals until you're left with a church of one. And I see that. You see it over and over again, especially in the history of Western Protestantism.
For pastors and church leaders then, who are maybe even PCA pastors who are hoping to learn something from this panel about what to do about polarization in their church, what is the way forward? The next few months are going to be brutal. It might go much further than past this election. And I mean, we've only seen polarization intensify over the last 8 years. So for pastors and church leaders who are sitting here today listening and they're saying, okay, well, what do I do in my church now? Because I got a lot of people in my church who would feel exactly like those who are saying cancel David French. I've got a lot of people in my church who are saying canceling David French was wrong. And that's just a stand-in for the sort of the larger questions, the heat of the politics at the moment and all of this. What does it look like? Is it even possible to bring those people together, to acknowledge that there's room inside the kingdom for people who are going to draw different lines this year?
The legal analyst Benjamin Wittes was talking this week about the comment that Donald Trump was falling asleep during his trial. And he said he's not falling asleep. He's closing his eyes and sitting back as a way of saying, I'm not listening to this. And I think that there's something very similar to that happening, especially in churches, of a sense of if we close our eyes and sit back, then we can just pretend that all of this is going to go away. And it's not. Everybody's looking for these simple answers to say, how do we magically make this go away until mid-November we all wake up and we go back to it? That's not going to happen. And so what you have to do is to differentiate between where are the particular places, how am I being called vocationally to engage in these different spaces? So you're going to have people who are going to need to engage in one way. They're speaking in the public arena. Then you've got relationships where you can say, okay, this is not the place for us to debate these things because we're in a different kind of relationship. You can do that. And that doesn't mean that you're avoiding the conflict. It means that you're seeing your different role in those places.
You do have to differentiate between different venues. And what is the pulpit actually for on Sundays? Is it for telling people how to think, or is it for proclaiming the forgiveness of sins and through the blood of Jesus Christ? I am quaint enough or old-fashioned enough to believe that it really is, that everywhere else I go in the culture is a political exhortation. If there's one place that can be reserved for hearing that all have fallen short of the glory of God, and yet, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, I think that is going to be absolutely essential. I think that by and large, most of the time when pastors think they have to comment, they don't. Sometimes they do. Of course they do. But I think that when we connote silence or simply graciousness with cowardice, we're getting it wrong. Because if you've ever actually tried keeping your mouth shut about stuff, you know that it's almost impossible, and that it's much easier in our situation you will be rewarded for being scornful and scoring points, especially from a public forum. What I would tell pastors to do is to continue to get existential and talk about death a lot. Talk about the fact that we're going to die, relativize this a little bit, and maybe I've got my head in the sand, but I had to preach the weekend in a very blue setting. I had to preach the week after Trump was elected, and it was like I was preaching to people who'd just been through a war, and they just didn't know what their head was up and what was down. And the passage that Sunday was about how the temple would be torn down and built again in 3 days. sometimes you do have to say, this narrative about it, everything being the most important election of all time, this candidate being Satan and this candidate being the perfect person. I think it's up to clergy to deconstruct that narrative. I just don't think it's true. So I think the amount of condemnation and fear everyone is feeling throughout the year is just palpable. Wouldn't it be great if there was a safe haven to run to once a week where you could hear about something that will outlast no matter what happens in November?
Where I would disagree with that is that you have a movement that wants to co-opt the Church of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. There has to be a differentiation between what is the gospel of Jesus Christ and this. And so the more that you see this confusion in the minds of both the adherents and the mission field as to what the Christian church is and who Jesus Christ is, there have to be Barmen Declaration moments that are saying, it's not that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's necessary.
I think you're right. There is a contextual difference here, and I don't want to deny that. I also think that God has given different pastors different gifts when it comes to preaching in their congregation. I do see in the life of our congregation a hunger for something vertical. And by that I mean heavenly directed, whereas because in at least the main line, things have gotten so horizontal, faith has been completely supplanted by basically ideological commitments or just service of other people, which is wonderful. But at the end of the day, something vertical, whether it be preaching red or blue, the hunger for something vertical I've found. And when I do want to say, while our context where I am in Charlottesville is very blue, our church is genuinely purple. And sometimes I've gotten the critique, it's like, well, does that mean you're just not talking about anything? I said, no, we're talking about a lot of things. And in fact, for a lot of these people, it's the only time they ever get together with people that vote differently from them. And I think that is of enormous value. But I want to recognize that I haven't experienced what the sort of blowback that Russell's experienced, as well as being in maybe a Southern Baptist context where America and Jesus have become synonymous, or Donald Trump and Jesus have become synonymous. I'm living in the alternate universe of that has very similar challenges, in that it's trying to equate Jesus with this set of causes. And the role of the pastor, you can understand why everyone just is bailing, because it's very difficult. You have to essentially absorb a huge amount of negativity in order to foster any kind of community where folks can come together and get vertical.
David Zahl, thank you so much for joining Russell and I on the Bulletin this week.
Thanks for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
We will be right back. In 2023, about 9% of adult women in the U.S. struggled with alcoholism. That totals about 11.7 million women. In an average church of 500 people, you'll have about 20 women attending who likely struggle with alcohol dependence. These statistics come from an article called The Secret Sin of Mommy Juice, written by Ericka Andersen. Ericka is a freelance writer and podcast host, and she is joining us now for this conversation. Ericka, welcome to the Bulletin.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
There's been this marked rise in alcohol abuse in the U.S. in general, but among Christians, particularly over the last decade or so. Can you talk a little bit about the article you wrote, the research behind it, and what you're seeing in this phenomenon right now?
What you'll find if you look at just the general research of alcoholism in America right now is that over the past 20 or 30 years, alcoholism among women generally has begun to rise significantly and almost speed up, it seems. There are statistics out of COVID showing that the rates of women that were binge drinking and having problems with alcohol increased far more than they did within men, especially women with young children. I, being one of those people with young children when COVID began and someone that was struggling with alcohol at the time, I noticed these numbers and I became very interested in what was going on and why were women more than men being affected, and how was the church speaking to this?
I grew up in the church. I grew up in Southern Baptist churches, grew up with a very hostile attitude towards alcohol. And as I grew older, I saw that starting to shift. It started to shift among my peers. Then I was part of sort of the Gen X church planting movement in the early 2000s, where alcohol became very normalized and mainstream. Is that a phenomenon that happened more broadly? And if so, what was it that fed that shift?
So I don't have any hard numbers on that, but I know exactly what you're talking about because I feel like in this time frame, maybe the 90s, early 2000s, things did start to shift. And it almost became like, at least in the church circles I was running in, if you were saying that you didn't drink alcohol, oh, you were a legalist. That was very extreme to not drink alcohol because it was a sin. People didn't think of it as a sin. And I'm not saying it is a sin, but I do think that there was a shift in attitudes among Christians more generally. Because of that, I think also when people are struggling with it, it's really like a silent problem that they don't know how to get help for within the church. I can tell you that for myself, it really felt like, who could I ever talk to about this? Like, it's too shameful. It's not supposed to be a problem. And I'm leading a Bible study and all of these things. I think that mentality shift without any kind of thought behind how we're going to still address this as an issue has caused sort of a gap in how we're able to minister to people.
I was just talking to a counselor this week who works with a lot of church planters. And he said the reason that he's able to be effective is because he's not inside any church planting office, because most of the people he's talking to have problems with alcohol belong to churches or networks or denominations that if they were to say, I think I'm drinking too much, they would be immediately fired because they were drinking at all. And so there's no off ramp. And I had a friend who was in that situation who, first thing that we knew, he was an alcoholic, needed to be in recovery, when along the way there were all kinds of places where there could have been intervention. He could never have said that without sacrificing everything. And so it became I'm just going to take care of this. Eventually I will get a hold of this. It complicates the matter even more.
I had a conversation similar with a counselor. He works with a lot of church planters as well, but he works in networks where drinking is very normalized. Yeah. He's had to deal with a lot of pastors who've dealt with alcohol abuse and alcohol addiction. So much of what he saw is people who grew up with it where it was forbidden, and then there was permission around it, but there wasn't necessarily wisdom. There wasn't even sort of like inherited wisdom around it.
There has to be a mind shift around that within those kinds of churches to understand that alcohol and addiction is not like anything else that you would do. It's not stealing. It's not cheating. It's a mental health problem. Addiction is a physical issue in your body. And so you have to think, instead of this person immediately gets fired, it should be, how can we help this person? They're having a hard time. Because addiction, this is obviously a debated point, but in many times it's not really much of a choice when you are in the throes of it. And it's a place where people need to feel that there is grace and that there is support. And if they're obviously in an environment where that can't happen, that's going to be to their detriment. You do not know who is struggling, and church should be a refuge and it should be a safe place. I'll never forget going on a church retreat one time years ago when I was still struggling with this. I was so glad. I was like, this weekend is going to be great. I'm going to connect with God. And my friends that I was staying with, they were like, let's go get some wine and sneak it in. And I was thinking, no, I'm trying to get away from this. I couldn't even do it then. And I've had other experience within church groups where alcohol was there. And I am so attuned to that now because you just never know who could be struggling with it.
Your article focuses specifically on women and alcohol and the specific ways alcohol affects women and the specific growth of alcoholism or alcohol addiction among women. Can you talk a little bit about what your research and reporting on that uncovered?
It really started, I want to say about 30 years ago, and it started with big alcohol and marketing to women when they realized women would spend more money on a drink if it was wrapped in a pink label, basically. When they discovered that, they started packaging their marketing aimed directly at women, at moms, at young women, all of the micro-targeting that you can imagine. And immediately we saw sales in alcohol start to go up. And what happened then, of course, is more and more people started to become addicted to alcohol because it is an addictive substance. The other side of that is that women's bodies really absorb alcohol very differently than men. It's more powerful. Our bodies obviously made up in different ways, different chemistries and things like that. Studies show that women can get addicted more easily, and it does affect them more so like in the immediate as well. They don't need as much for it to be causing a problem. And so as we've seen that grow, I use this example for people to get, because you hear a lot of times, okay, well, 1 in 5 women have had an abortion, so you can assume that 1 in 5 women in your church have had one. Same thing when it comes to this addiction and alcohol. If, say, 15% of women have trouble with alcohol, then you should assume that 15% of the women in your church are having trouble with alcohol, because it does not discriminate based on religion, obviously. And I do not think that there is a awareness of that, because the kind of people that are struggling with alcohol, you would not know. They are accomplished. They are moms. They are leading Bible studies. I've gotten emails from people that are worship leaders and pastors' wives. It just needs to be a conversation that's happening more openly, which is why I feel like, God's sort of given me this sort of courage to talk about this and open up that conversation for more people.
Ericka, suppose there's a woman in a church who's listening to this right now who's thinking, maybe I am starting to have trouble here. I'm getting dependent on this. I don't know. What would you advise them to do?
I would first really advise someone to lean into their curiosity. People that are struggling with addiction, alcohol specifically, like the first thing that you start to feel is fear, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to give it up. I would say lean into the questions and the curiosity for one. I would definitely tell at least one person, like a trusted friend, your spouse, something like that. There's a Brene Brown quote, shame dies in the light, I believe, something like that. I'm messing it up. But the reality is that when you put it out there, it doesn't have as much of a hold over you. So I would say definitely do that. If you feel comfortable taking it to a trusted leader in your church or your pastor, I definitely would go that route. Get the prayer and the support that you need there. And then there are not a ton of great Christian resources for this, but Celebrate Recovery is a great thing if you have one nearby you. So I have a little packet of resources that people are welcome to pick up at sobrietycurious.com. And that's just some of my favorite resources if this is something that you're struggling with and you think you might want to just take that first step.
You've been very transparent about your own struggles with this. I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about what led you to the place where you said, I think I need to address some things here and to be willing to talk about this stuff publicly?
It's been a many years long struggle for me. I mean, it's always been something that I knew I had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol and used it in ways that I shouldn't, especially as a Christian. And so after many years of feeling that way and just this tug of war, can't tell you how many years I wrote down in my prayer journals, like, Lord, please take this away from me. I don't want to struggle with this anymore. I got to a point where I was like, you really have to try doing this. And it took a lot of stops and starts, and there were a lot of failures along the way. Finding a community, a support community, was extremely important. The first thing I did that really got me on my way was telling my small group at church, which was super hard at the time. I was so self-conscious. And
Did they respond well?
oh, they did. They were wonderful. And they were like, yeah, my sister struggled with this, and thank you for telling us. And there was no judgment. It was really what's, kind of set off the path. I mean, it's like what the church is for, it's God gave us those people in our lives who support us in these hard times. And if we should be using them for that. Ultimately, I had my eyes set on, I can do this for a year, which, by the way, the first 30 days are the hardest. Do not give up after 30 days. That's the hardest part. So ultimately, after a year, I felt pretty confident in my sobriety, and I started telling my story online a little bit. And I just realized, there was nobody like this for me. I was searching for someone that I could identify with, a Christian specifically, and there was nobody back then. And I said, I want to be that voice and that person that someone feels safe, that they don't feel weird, that they know that you don't have to be ruining your entire life to address this problem. And it's okay.
Do you feel like the church has done a good job of being receptive and encouraging as you've shared your story? Because I think a lot of people fear, if I talk about this, kind of like we were talking about earlier, if I say anything about this, this is one of those sins, you cross the threshold here, there's no coming back.
Obviously, I can't speak for all churches. I think the church doesn't talk about it that much. I think there needs to be a lot more awareness. I tell this story of a woman that I interviewed for the story who works with Celebrate Recovery. And she said her church began Celebrate Recovery. They didn't start it, but a chapter of it. After her pastor did an anonymous survey asking the congregation, what are the things that you're struggling with? And it came back, and there was a whole bunch of people that had said they were struggling with addiction. And he had no idea. And so that's why they brought Celebrate Recovery. That was so powerful to me, because I thought, I think every church should be doing that, because you don't know the secret things that people are struggling with because they're not talking about them. And maybe they wouldn't go to, a public sort of meeting about it. And so I think the church needs to be talking about it more. And I think there are more voices than ever now, but I think we need more of them, and we need more ministry awareness and resources for this topic, because it is so pervasive when you look at the numbers of people that are suffering across the country.
And then when you look at the culture of the church, things like churches that serve only wine at communion. You write about that in the story, or the sort of casual way. Another thing you mentioned in the story is a ministry that gathered at was it a wine bar or a whiskey bar to kind of plan ministry events and that sort of thing.
I'm not sure if this is the story, but I had a mission team I was going on a mission trip with, and we would meet at a bar, and the guys would always get whiskey. And I just felt like, as someone who was secretly struggling, I was just like, this, I wish wasn't happening.
Yeah. It's one of those things I think there's often a lack of awareness about what that communicates to people who may be struggling, or the fact that there may be people struggling in your midst. So the piece is The Secret Sin of Mommy Juice. Ericka Andersen, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for listening. We will be back next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's executive produced by Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper. It's produced by Clarissa Mall and Matt Stevens. Post-production by TJ Hester. Our art for this episode is by Rick Shooks. Music by Dan Phelps. And social media by Kate Lucky. Thanks for listening.